My name is Mike Thompson, and I'm the Triad Coordinator at RSVP of Dane County. Before I introduce our first presenter this morning, let me say that if during the presentation you have a question, please enter it in the chat box. I'm going to be keeping an eye on it, and will bring your attentions to the speaker's attention. Bring your questions to the speaker's attention. Second, for everyone who's requested continuing education hours, Zoom is keeping track of your attendance, and your certificate will be emailed to you at the conclusion of the conference. We're very fortunate to have with us today Professor Ken Streit from the University of Wisconsin Law School. Ken began lawyering on the south side of Milwaukee, serving low-income persons. He came to Madison to establish Wisconsin's Protection and Advocacy Agency for developmentally disabled persons. He took a break from lawyering for a few years to serve as a policy analyst to the state government on issues of juvenile delinquency, child welfare, criminal sentencing, and alternatives to incarceration. In 1990, Ken returned to law when he began teaching at the UW Law School, where he supervised students in clinical programs and taught legal ethics and juvenile justice. He continued to serve as a policy advisor to the state and Milwaukee County on sentencing of adults and policy regarding community policing and corrections. Professor Streit's presentation is titled Crime, Statistics, and the Risks of Victimization. Welcome, Ken, and thank you for taking the time to address us on this very important topic.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here. Can people see my screen?
I can see it fine.
Okay, then I'll keep going. As Mike just mentioned, here's a little bit of my background. The main place, if you look down the middle, well, I started working all around Wisconsin when I set up the current Protection and Advocacy Agency, and went to a lot of rural counties there. This was the time that special education laws were getting implemented, and I realized that each school district, each county was very unique, and that a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to data doesn't work. You really have to dig down into the county levels. As an administrative law judge, I was mainly doing revocation hearings and traveled all around the state. This was the beginning of being in all 72 county courthouses. And I learned that, so this was revocation, people on parole or on probation. And I had to make a determination of as far as whether or not they had violated their rules, and if so, whether or not they needed to be revoked. Again, I found that each community was different, and that the problems of the south side of Milwaukee were not the same as the north side of Milwaukee, were not the same as Eau Claire or Green Bay or anything like that. After a while, if agents want to appeal my decision to not revoke, they went to the head of the Department of Health and Social Services. So I got to meet him very often, because I probably was the least likely of the half dozen people who were judges to revoke, because I would always say, well, this could have been done differently, and he should be given not another chance, but that we failed to provide that person with the proper services. After a while, the secretary hired me to be his advisor on corrections policy. And so then I was asked to come up with different kinds of intervention programs that would assist the local probation agents in reducing the number of people who violated the rules so seriously that they needed to be revoked. So that led me then to work with legislators and governor's office a lot. It was sort of by accident that I wound up being in there, but it seemed more fulfilling than sitting and repeatedly having to revoke people and all that. It especially led me to juvenile delinquency, and juvenile delinquency still to this day, the state funds counties as far as offering alternatives to residential placement. And I was assigned, I spent a lot of time in Milwaukee, and it was basically assigned to try to figure out why the funds ran out so quickly in Milwaukee when they seemed sufficient in other places. And again, that led me to seeing the unique issues as far as the risks and rates of crimes. In the Remington Center, I supervised 6 students at a time over the course of 23 years and probably interacted with 2,000 to 3,000 prison inmates, both men and women, and really got to know them and got to know their backgrounds and the circumstances that led to their convictions. So that sort of was then the background. I also then continued to be a consultant for corrections and Department of Corrections, and even wound up for 4 years being the court monitor for the consent agreement as far as the conditions at Supermax in Boscobel. The thing that I'd like to emphasize today is that most of the news that you get is national news. National news is constantly searching for something new. And that means that it will find incredibly unique situations. Some of you might be old enough to remember a situation of a little girl named Jessica who fell in a well in Texas. People still remember that. And the reason they remember it is because it got incredible media attention, even though to my knowledge, nobody has fallen in a well since then, possibly because there were good responses and they filled in those wells and things like that. But it was so unique that it just was riveting as far as our attention. The more frequently something happens, the less likely that it's newsworthy. Pam gets home from school is not newsworthy. Pam does not get home from school is somewhat newsworthy. Pam still isn't home from school 3 weeks later is definitely newsworthy, and that simply is the frequency or the lack of frequency. The other part is, and we'll get at this a little bit later, the more that a fatal event happens in a low probability location, the more news coverage it will receive. So if somebody is shot at the Washington Monument, that will get a lot of attention, even if it's not a fatal event. It simply will get a lot of attention because for the most part, there's a lot of security around the Washington Monument. There's a lot of reasons that when we go there, the last thing we're thinking about is the possibility of getting shot, and also because we identify with it. I would guess that of the people on this call right now, perhaps half of the people have been to Washington, D.C., and many of those have been to the Washington Monument. So you can sort of identify with that location as well. On the other hand, the closer an event happens to an individual, the more likely it should influence your future behavior. So an example is currently in Wisconsin, I know for certain that in both Milwaukee and Madison, teenagers, oftentimes 11 to 15 years old, are incredibly good at stealing cars. They steal the cars even more often when people leave their cars with the keys in the car, unlocked in the driveway overnight. And so while people have been able to get away with that for decades, all of a sudden, at least in Madison, this has become the new rage. And so the issue is that even though for decades you've left the keys in your car overnight, and it's a Lexus or a Mercedes or something like that, and nothing happened, you need to be aware of the fact that it's now happening, and that should change your behavior. You should lock your cars, especially if they have a garage door opener in them, because they use the garage door opener to get into the garage, and nobody locks the door between their garage and their house, and all of a sudden it's a burglary. In Milwaukee, it's a slightly different situation. The teenagers there specialize in stealing Kias and Hyundais because those two manufacturers have a a flaw in their back window, which allows people to break in and open up the car door, and then they strip the steering wheel and they drive around. And the main issue is partly the loss of the car, but partly that these cars are driven 70 to 100 miles an hour through the city of Milwaukee. So that is a new trend. And even though the trend line nationally is not that big, you need to be aware that that's happening in your neighborhood. And especially if in Milwaukee you own either of those two cars and you never had a steering wheel lock before, you need to get a steering wheel lock, and they're free from the Milwaukee Police Department. So crime trends are, there's national ones. That's what we're seeing right now in the news. A lot of reporting because all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, especially the homicide trends are going up. It's not that in a large number of places they had ever been low. It's just that now they're spiking. And what seems to be confusing is that at a national level, the property crime, so the overall crime, and we'll get to see how much of overall crime is property crime, goes down while violent crime goes up. So that is something that either because the reporter is sort of naive or just not well educated, but that's a newsworthy kind of thing because you have opposite trends. People think that the trend of violent crime should follow the overall trend. When you're seeing national things, especially with relatively low incident crime, and homicide is the lowest incident crime, the influence of large cities can overwhelm low incident trend lines. So like if everything else is 1 million a year and homicides are at 100 a year and they go up to 130, you have a 30% increase in homicides. And even if all 30 of those came from only St. Louis and Kansas City, it totally influences the national trend line. So especially on low incidence crimes, trend lines can change relatively quickly. And as a result, because news is always going for things with big percentages, increases or decreases, that will make the news. In Wisconsin, the influence of large cities certainly has trend line changes. Burglary, burglary and theft are fairly pervasive in all 72 counties. And theft, as we'll see later, is the largest volume of crime, but includes shoplifting, for example, over a certain amount of stuff. People steal flat screen TVs in each and every county in the state. And it is a remarkably widespread kind of thing with no clear, not nearly as clear demographics as a number of other kinds of crimes would be. Similarly, in a county, trend lines for the county are oftentimes influenced by your largest city. And so you could have spikes upward for the overall county, and all of that is driven by the behavior in the city, while the rest of the surrounding suburbs and the rural areas are actually improving as far as crime rates. And also in the cities, it is neighborhood by neighborhood. I do a lot of consulting with Milwaukee, in the city of Milwaukee and the county of Milwaukee, and they have a homicide review commission, which puts a dot on every location and of their homicides. And basically of the city of Milwaukee, probably 80% or more of all the events happen in about 10% of the land area of Milwaukee. It's very, very concentrated kind of situation. So when you're looking at crime trends and statistics, it's sort of, what's the jurisdiction? What's the baseline? How long is the trend being? in doing this, they'll short time frame versus a long time frame. So like the recent thing for the homicides, basically the recent headlines are over the last 2 years, and they've been especially looking at the pandemic. When you look at it, however, over 10 years, the rate now is lower than it was 10 years ago. And that's because while there was a steady, a relatively steady drop, and now we have a spike upward. That's sort of the situation of the example on the bottom. If you had an average of 1,000 annually with a wide range, high and low, if in 2000 you had 500, which would sometimes not make news because drop in crime is not as newsworthy as increase in crime, or at least to media. And then 220, or in 2020, you had 750, what would the headline be? I'll guarantee you the headline will be in crime in 2020 goes up by 50%. And as opposed to crime in 2020 is at 3/4 of the decade average. That's sort of how things go. Also, the issue as far as apples and oranges, we'll get into that in one of the next slides, but it's the difference between high volume crime and low volume crime. For the most part, prisons are basically occupied by people who commit the lowest volume crime. The lowest volume crime is homicide and other crimes that have serious personal injury involved. And so, fortunately, that is a very low rate of crime. And so when you mix violent crime with property crime, you can have an overall crime trend that sort of disguises what the crime trends are that really most affect the neighborhoods. Here's just an example for Wisconsin. So they call the Unified Crime Report, which the FBI gathers statistics on, has both Part 1 crime and Part 2 crime. Part 2 crime is a lot of the drug crimes, disorderly, simple assault, things like that, and all that. Part 1 is the thing that sort of is most likely to get the attention of the prosecutor's office, most likely to get a suspect in the back of a police car, things like that. As you can see, homicide is 1/6 of 1% of all the Part 1 crimes. On the other hand, as we'll see in a later in a later slide, there's about 22,000, 23,000 people in state prison. Probably about 4,000 to 6,000 of them are in there for committing a crime which resulted in the death of a person. So at least 1/4 of the state prison population, that inmate had been involved in a crime resulting in death. And that includes everything from first degree with life sentences through negligent manslaughter and things like that. Rape and robbery are relatively small, 2 to 3%. Aggravated assault, as you can see, is over 2/3 of all what's called violent crime. And one of the things that we'll talk about is that whereas there's really been no change in the statutory definition of homicide. And homicide, a person dying in a criminal case, is almost 100% accurately reported. As we all know, rape is not necessarily reported. There are a lot of situations that meet the legal definition of rape that for one reason or another, the victim does not report it. Robbery is reported, but there are other influences. Oftentimes, a person who is already a victim of robbery can be intimidated to not report that offense. So that isn't. aggravated assault, the situation there is, again, a lot of aggravated assault. I don't want to say friends, but acquaintances, known others are the offenders in aggravated assault cases. So bullies, things like that. And so aggravated assault, while it has a certain legal definition, there's a lot of uncertainty as far as whether or not that is regularly reported, and especially in certain circumstances where there is high pressure not to cooperate with the police and things like that, or threats that would intimidate the victim's family, that wouldn't be reported.
Ken, could I jump in and ask just a second? When we're talking about elders being abused, we had a really terrific presentation 2 weeks ago about elder abuse, and many of those cases are done by relatives, even living in the same house. You know, when we're talking about that, what percentage of the total of these do you think would be seniors being beaten up or physically abused by
Well, that's where I'm saying it's very soft, because you have situations where elders and other domestic abuse, the victim is then also very dependent on the offender for having other necessities of life being delivered to them. You know, younger people, often usually it's the woman, need the financial help of the person that's beating them up. The older person, possibly at that point, there's also some reduction in their feeling of confidence. And so they're dependent on a child or somebody else. And they do a little bit more rationalization to say, you know, that person, they have some errors, but overall, I don't want to get them into trouble. So I would say, compared to the street level aggravated assault, that is much more dependent on a neutral third party noticing the bruises. An elderly person coming in and to the emergency room, and they say, this bone broke because of a fall. Well, the emergency department knows the difference between a fall and a blow with a baseball bat and things like that. So those generally are going to be very dependent upon, did another person come across that situation while the bruise was still visible, or did somebody disguise it? You know, I think the aggravated assault, they do a lot of studies, Mike, on what can we do better for reporting. And so, you know, I think they do a whole lot of training, but there is then still the thing that almost by nature, the range of older people, some who have just dozens of contacts outside of their house, and some who lead a very lonely life and simply do not come out in public and things like that, they are especially vulnerable.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Thank you. And we have quite a number of APS professionals here. If you have experiences that you'd like to pass along, please enter them in the chat box. Anyway,
so all I'm getting at is from frequency, there's a lot of slippage, so to speak, in are these accurately reported. So these are Unified Crime Report. This is offenses actually done. There is another thing that is out of Bureau of Justice Services in the U.S. Justice Department that does crime surveys. So they'll say, regardless of whether you reported this burglary to the police, have you had your house burglared in the last 12 months and things like that. So those numbers are always much higher. And a situation in both burglary and larceny is, what does the person who could report the crime believe they get out of reporting the crime? So in In certain parts, people don't have very much confidence in the police, and unless they have insurance, and that insurance requires a police report, they simply won't report the burglary, or they'll say the amount that was stolen was too small to report, and things like that. In larceny theft, the big reason for the drop in larceny theft is, or could be, is that, so a lot of this is theft from retail outlets. And if the local police are not necessarily all that helpful to the store owners in recovering this or anything like that, after a while, store owners might just simply say, we'll just chalk it up to, inventory loss, and we won't report it. So again, those two crimes, a lot of that is the motivation for what do I get in return for reporting that crime? And so the accuracy might be a little bit less. And then in vehicle theft, there's sort of two types of vehicle theft. One is sort of the joyriding. The person who steals it is not intent on financially benefiting from the theft. And then there's the other one where you sell it, take it out of state and sell it, and maybe it's sold to a chop shop and things like that. But that's still a fairly high number. Let's just keep moving on here. Here, an issue is sort of different trends in things. So the left-hand side is violent rate of crime. And so for some of you who might be old enough to sort of think about the 70s, and I use that as the baseline there, relatively low. The amount of crime in the last decade, violent crime, is about 2.3 times what it was back then. And it's sort of been hovering at that level. There was a big spike, especially as guns and gun-related drug dealing hit Wisconsin. That sort of peaked in the year 1992. And a lot of people thought, okay, that sort of is over with and it's going to come down. It hasn't necessarily come down. And so while if you used, on the other hand, and you said 2010 and the most recent decade compared to the 90s, well, that would probably only be about a 15% increase in crime. So you would, most people, if they use that time frame, would say it's relatively steady. The big difference in what was reported nationally a lot during the last decade or two was the overall drop in Part 1 crimes. But as you can see, while that's true, it doesn't necessarily reveal that the violent crime trends were continuing to creep up while the property crimes were mainly what was dropping it down. This is what I talked about before. If you generally have, out of the 23,000 people who is in prison in Wisconsin, 68% most recently are in for violent crimes. That would be the homicides, the forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. So when people say, oh, the prisons are filled with marijuana smokers, really not the case at all. Property crime, well, property crime is there's a whole lot of property crime. You as a criminal have to work really hard to get into prison on property crime. It either has to be a really big amount or you have to have been revoked from your probation 4 or 5 times before you eventually are going to get in. And then generally the other reason is there's a lot of admissions for property crime, but usually the amount of time that you spend in prison is relatively short. So not giving just an example, but this might not be accurate. The average term for a property offender might be 18 months. The average term for a violent offender might be 15 years. So that also, there's a high turnover as far as property crime. Drug is probably 99% drug sales in those situations. Now, a lot of people in state prisons also have a concurrent drug conviction, but that's not their most serious case. So this 12% is only the ones where their most serious case is drug offending. And finally, about 10% are in for drunk driving. And as some of you may know, drunk driving is, while we tend to think about it as far as young people, average age of admission for OWI into state prison is in the 50-year-old range, above that, partly because you have to have like 4 or 5 before you are going to go to prison, but partly because people with serious alcohol problems are really of all ages. We kid ourselves to think that this is just a young person's kind of thing. So now we're going to talk a little bit as far as risk to elderly. Violent crime mainly involves age cohorts and vicinity. Wisconsin used to have an incredibly high clearance rate. That means there's an arrest made for crime, an incredibly high clearance rate for homicide, because homicide really requires generally a whole lot of emotion, and you're enraged at somebody, and generally that means they're a relative or a former relative or an acquaintance. People tend not to just randomly get enraged at strangers and all that. And so while it doesn't necessarily comply with our TV version of Law and Order and things like that, they would generally, law enforcement solving the crime would look first at the first 1 or 2 circles of family and friends, and those would tend to be the ones who would have the highest motivation and the highest access to doing it. In the Milwaukee area, especially young men and their quote unquote acquaintances are at the very highest risk. You generally, the person who is the offender is within a few years of the person who is the victim. Generally, you live in the same neighborhood. You do not have people driving 60 miles to another city to randomly attack strangers and things like that. Recently, the frustration is that smallest social slights are resulting in gunfire and things like that. But the slights generally, again, come from the people that you're closest to. This is especially then a situation where it's not that there aren't elderly victims of homicides, it's that they generally are going to be reported and talked about a lot because they are so rare. At least they're so rare in Wisconsin. So I don't want to diminish the fact that there could be that. Dane County had a situation not so long ago where a man with mental health problems drove half a mile to kill his sister, and they were both in their 60s and things like that. So that would be clearly in the random kind of area. Well, anyway, and this is also, like I said before, a huge difference among neighborhoods. So I referred to the Milwaukee Homicide Commission, where you have probably for the whole state, there's 4 zip codes for the whole state that maybe account for 2/3 to 75% of all the homicide victims, very neighborhood oriented. Down lower, the people 60 years old and older, they're 17% of the US population. They're 6% of the violent crime victims. This is US. And in most situations, again, I can't say always, when an older person is a victim of a violent crime, there are occasional situations where there's going to be a carjacking of an older person and things like that, or a break-in, a burglary gone bad and things like that. But generally, the person who is the victim, an older victim, is going to know who the person is who was violent against them. That's what we were talking about before, the elderly abuse. Elderly abuse, I still want to do this. There's one where it's sort of like the hidden elderly abuse. They're very secret about it, and it sort of takes a long time before people start piecing things together. There are also things where there are people who are violent against the elderly in the middle of the street and things like that. And so even in those circumstances, again, the emotion and things like that is generally what it is. I don't want to say that there's sort of a certain amount of honor among offenders and they say, oh no, that person's too old to rob or anything like that. The general reason why they don't rob an older person is older people tend not to have very many things on them that are valuable to the person who wants to rob them. I mean, that's why they rob age cohorts, because the age cohort person has something valuable that they want, or they rob somebody who appears to have some wealth on them and things like that. So, I mean, possibly if elderly people walked around with more swag and things like that, they would be attacked more often. But there's a motivation in why people attack and rob people. And for the most part, an elderly person is not, well, they're attractive to me, but they're not attractive to a criminal for the most part. I just want to talk a little bit about this because it's not talked about very much, and I know, probably not. It partly tells the story of why, for the most part, people don't pay attention to things. So the overall victimization in all of the United States is a little bit more than 5 people per 100,000 for homicide. For Blacks in the United States, it's 20 per 100,000. For Blacks in Wisconsin, it's nearly 38 per 100,000. And only Missouri, which has both St. Louis and Kansas City in it, has a higher Black homicide victimization rate. And so when you then look at it, the white homicide rate in Wisconsin is 2. What I'm getting at here for elderly is this pretty much carries over for older people as well. While I think we all should be very caring and really trying to focus on trying to find out ways to get the overall homicide rate in Wisconsin down, the fact is that elderly in probably 90% of the geographic area of Wisconsin are simply not in the neighborhoods where highly violent crime takes place. Again, that the abuse of elderly by kids and others, that is pervasive as far as the rates don't concentrate by neighborhoods or anything like that. But the sort of public crime, so to speak, as I'll call the abuse of elderly sort of private crime. The public crime is a highly concentrated thing. And so, and generally victims and their and the offender are of the same race, again, because of proximity. People are mainly threatened by people who are close to them, unfortunately. I mean, I don't mean close emotionally, but close in a physically proximate way. I want to go back to, as Mike had noted, the keynote speaker really took a whole lot. I wasn't planning on covering it as much as he did, but the main crime that elderly people have to focus on is the scams by the strangers, home improvement, credit card kind of situation. They very much are targeting older people because they recognize sometimes that either the, let's say you're isolated, and whereas I can do pretty well at not picking up a phone call, if you are otherwise sort of lonely, you maybe pick up a phone call. If you're otherwise sort of interested in interaction, you might respond to an email and open up an attachment that then leads to all sorts of devious fraud and things like that. And you also, without going too much on cognitive decline, you might not put it together that that email really didn't come from Bill Gates or whoever else it was inviting you to just put in $100 so that you can share in his fortune and things like that. And so the scammers are able to get different kind of lists that specifically target people of a certain age who they feel are going to be much more likely to respond to them. I guess what I'm saying is those are the things that elderly really need to be encouraged to be watching out for. Not that you should be casual with the other things that are part of Part 1 crimes and things like that. Not that you shouldn't be aware that there's car theft that's starting up in your neighborhood. You should always close your garage door. You should always lock your house and things like that, you know. But the things that we're looking at right here are much more important. The embezzlement, as he talked about, by trusted relatives and friends. Now, I put trusted in because sometimes they are, everything else about them seems like they should be trustworthy. But there are always bad apples. There's fellow church members that have been great church members in that congregation for 20 years that all of a sudden see the opportunity to do something and they can't even believe that they're ripping off another congregation member and things like that. So the best thing in those circumstances, I think, is for you to encourage people whenever they're dealing with financial matters, even if they have, let's say the oldest daughter is the person who has power of financial attorney. You should encourage them to have other family members have access to the financial reports, have access to the checkbook, not to write checks, but to just sort of look at that and to say, this seems like way too many checks are written out to Janice. You know, just way too many to cash and things like that. So having another 2 or 3 pairs of eyes on your finances is something. And the hard part of it is that, you know, at what point is that important? I'm 72 years old. I'm thinking I'm doing pretty well. But having remembered my parents, I'm pretty sure that within the next 8 years, it wouldn't hurt for me to have another pair of eyes when I'm dealing with my financial kind of stuff. What day do I make that decision? I'll put that off as long as possible and maybe never make that decision. So those embezzlement issues are something that you, with other elderly people, really need to be proactive about before the problems arise. And it's hard because you sort of have to admit that, you know, you've been doing this on your own for 45 years, and now it wouldn't hurt to have another person involved. The real problem is there's no triggering event, or rarely a triggering event. The property crime thing, the motor vehicle, the issue of locking your car, the issue of right now in Madison and also in Milwaukee, all of a sudden you have kids in a stolen car drive up to you while you're at the Quick Trip or the Shell station and basically take your car from you. That doesn't happen all over the place. And it's certainly something that probably 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I would have left my car open with everything in it, unlocked, and go into the Quick Trip to the bathroom and spent a total of 10 minutes in there shopping and never thought about locking my car. Well, you just have to change. You just have to change. And possibly for older people, possibly some older people are going to be paranoid and they've been locking their cars better than the rest of us for a long time. Others are just saying, oh, that's never going to happen to me. Well, it is. The burglary issues, again, I don't want people to feel like they have to live in their castles with the ramps drawn up. It's just sort of an audit. You know, do you have your windows closed? Do you lock your doors? If you're out chatting in the front yard, is your back door open? Things like that. The theft issues, that's probably more keeping your property secured and locking your doors. Do you have any questions? I've gone on pretty long here.
Yes, Ken, we had a couple of comments here. One from Amy Scar, who works in Dane County on elderly abuse issues. That said, I've noticed that many times the offender abuser is more resource dependent on the elder than the other way around. Often, you know, the senior has a dependable check coming in every month, you know, and often, you know, I mean, it's not uncommon to have a kid who's not done well in life and settles in with mom or dad until, you know, they pass away. And so this kind of emotional connection really abuses them. I mean, that's one comment.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay, so I would agree that frequently the person who's the abuser is living inside the same house. Or has ready access to the house. They have keys to the house. This is not a stranger kind of situation. And, you know, I mean, now in this generation, there's a lot of people who are a lot younger than elderly people who have kids living in their basement and things like that. But I know who she means in those circumstances. And again, a lot of times there's sort of a quid pro quo kind of thing. I don't want to say quid pro quo. They know how to be dependent. They know how to manipulate the parent. Sometimes there's the threat of physical abuse is enough, but a lot of times, I think she would agree with me, it's more emotional abuse. You know, like, you give me the whole check and I'll give you an allowance. I'll do the shopping. You're not, you're just a check for us. And I think she would also agree that partly the reason that they're in the basement, but partly the other thing is there's also oftentimes an addiction, either alcohol or other kinds of things by the person who's abusing, which leads them not to be able to hold a job. and but needing income both for their substance and other things. So those are sort of, I think she would see as flag kind of situations. But they're not always the case. You know, the neighbor 2 doors down, he got divorced. He wound up living with his mom. Everything was just fine. Now, he also had his own income and things like that. So probably if you did a risk thing, we could probably get down to a situation where in-house children could be on a risk scale from 0 to 10, which would then say these kind of things should be checked out.
Yeah. I had one comment by Jim Jenkins, who's a former DCI agent. He says, in Madison, crime seems to be more widespread and has often occurred at gas stations, such as the shooting here just a few weeks ago. We've had a couple of incidents at Quick Trips, and downtown, where all ages and demographics are present. Although I notice, I mean, if you do look at Madison's community crime map, right? I mean, you do see these concentrations of incidents in very specific neighborhoods, although, you know, you hear about the situation Jim's talking about.
I think you, if you check with the police in Madison, even though, so Madison has several areas. There's a southwest area, there's a southeast area, there's a north area, and things like that. And also, I mean, I don't want to say that I'm weird, but, you know, I do probably still pay attention to, even if it's just shots fired and shells recovered kind of situation. Those are not nearly as highly concentrated as in Milwaukee, but they're relatively concentrated compared to all of the square miles of Madison. I would say the State Street area has a situation where, while there's an occasional situation with a gun, and there's a certain, well, I think the reason for State Street area is this. So I have to be sort of graphic as far as the race issues in Madison. There are State Street areas, probably the area where there is the most diversity as far as Madison's population. All of Madison's population comes down State Street. That doesn't happen, for those of you who are in Madison, that doesn't happen at Hilldale. It doesn't happen for the most part on the university campus or in a number of East Side neighborhoods and all that kind of stuff. And so that's where you sort of, people are more aware of the behavior, but the behavior that you would then see as who's in the Dane County Jail is those offenders tend to have events that happen in those neighborhoods. Let me just go back. The motor vehicle thing in Madison, that's unusual. For those of you who are in Madison, there's an area sort of west of Costco that is a new area of Madison where homes probably start at $500,000 and go up to a couple of $1 million and things like that. People who want to do joyriding have discovered that you get in the car, you get over there at about time that people go to work, especially in the wintertime. They start their cars and they leave their cars running with the keys in the ignition and the car is gone. Now that never used to happen, but all of a sudden that's happening. And so there's things you can do to change that. Sit in your car, don't leave the car, you know, I mean, those kind of behaviors. The car theft has been happening a whole lot in the neighborhoods that I talked a lot before. Again, proximate. People steal cars from people who are nearby and things like that. And so I don't want to say that it doesn't happen all over. There are incidents all over, but they're mainly in the news because it's unusual. as opposed to, if there's a burglary in one of the usual spots, it doesn't get reported in Madison newspapers or Madison media at all. But if there is a burglary in Parkwood Hills, then that gets reported.
Right. Well, Ken, thank you so much for this fantastic presentation today. It's been really eye-opening, and hopefully everyone starts to put together the intersection of media and reality here. Dominique Brizard, our next presenter, is going to help us with that. But I just want to thank you again for presenting today.
It has been a pleasure, Mike. It would have been a pleasure if I could have seen faces of people in the audience, but after 2 years of not being able to do that, I'm pretty used to just seeing a little smiling face in the corner of my screen.
Well, hopefully, perhaps we can have you for another monthly triad presentation here sometime in the next year.
I'd appreciate the invitation. Goodbye.
All righty. Thank you so much.